This is the Westminster Standard Podcast. I'm Ryan Beasy. Welcome. Today I'm joined by ruling elder David Saulsbury and teaching elder Matthew Everhard. Welcome, Matthew. This is your. You've been on the show a number of times, so just briefly.
Fourth time, I think. Yeah,
Four
yeah.
times. Well, you are almost a handful then. Um, would you briefly tell people where you are at Gospel Fellowship PCA? And
That's right. You said it. Gospel Fellowship PCA. I'm one of the pastors here. We're just north of Pittsburgh. If you're anywhere close, come check us out in real life. We have services at 8:30 and 11. And I'm also adjunct professor. I teach evangelism at the Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary, RPTS, right here in Pittsburgh. So come check that out too.
Wonderful. And David, this is your first time on the podcast.
It is.
So glad to have you. You are a ruling elder at Westminster Kingsport, and you also have a doctorate, a PhD, that I, for some reason, can never remember properly. So would you introduce yourself to us?
Yeah, the PhD is in business with the focus area of strategic management on that. So yes, I am a ruling elder here at Westminster in Kingsport. And for those who are not familiar with the geography, it's in the northeast end of the state. One of those areas that everyone wants to move to, including Mr. Beasy. So we're glad to have him in our presbytery and in our geographical area. Excited about that.
So glad to be in Westminster Presbytery. I was once a member of Mississippi Valley Presbytery, which Bebo Elkin calls the best presbytery in the PCA. But I tell you, I've been to 4 presbytery meetings in the 5 months that I've been a member here. And this presbytery sure gives Mississippi Valley a run for its money. So
Gives us something to aspire to.
This is a great presbytery. So I appreciate you both joining the conversation today. I want to talk about the coordinator's report for Mission to North America. Mission to North America has been embroiled in some scandals over the last year, especially under the previous coordinator's tenure. How would you characterize, just as elders looking at the church, how would you have characterized the mission and the vision and the concerns of Mission to North America on a General Assembly level up until this year?
Well, I'll go first, and I'll say, I'm an ardent fan and defender of the PCA. I love our denomination. I think it's so great in so many areas. I can't wait to go to General Assembly this summer, by the way, see old friends again and get to hear wonderful reports. We have so many great ministries in the PCA that it's hard to know what to be most proud of because we're doing so many things, I think, really well for the glory of God. However, that being said, occasionally we find one of our ministries or committees or groups or programs struggles just a little bit. And I would say that in the past couple of years, it's been a little bit wobbly in the area of MNA, which is our Mission to North America ministry endeavor. There's been a couple of controversies that they've stepped into in the last year or so. Sometimes, in my view, perhaps getting in their own way just a little bit with communicating things and maybe making a few policy decisions that have caused people to go, And one of those things, just to name a couple of them that have been a little bit, awkward, M&A had some guidance related to immigrants in one's community, illegal immigrants, people who are here without proper papers and so forth, gave some guidance, especially when the Trump administration began to utilize the ICE, the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, a little bit more aggressively. And some people shook their head a little bit at that and wondered whether that was a good idea or whether we should be giving that kind of advice or not. So that's one example. Probably the other thing that's jumped out to me a little bit is that M&A has tended to support some things that we might call in line with wokeist ideology or perhaps critical race theory. Now, I'm not trying to hyper polarize the conversation by throwing out those terms, but for lack of better terminology, some things have been categorized by those terms in some neighborhoods. So for instance, there was a service that was held in an evening service in one particular church. We don't need to name the specifics necessarily. That was purported to be like a Black only service and so forth. And some of our higher ranking personnel have supported those kinds of things to a greater or lesser degree. Again, maybe we don't need to get into some of the specifics, but it's caused some people to shake their heads and go, And then the other thing that kind of rose to the surface is the finances of M&A seem to be in a desperate way, at least as far as we got our report last year at the General Assembly. So those couple of things kind of together gave some people the impression that maybe M&A was having some speed wobbles, and it brought a little bit of attention to that particular ministry.
David, as a ruling elder and as someone who understands how institutions and organizations function, have you had concerns about missions to North America over the last few years?
Yes, Ryan. I think, Matthew talked about a couple of those, but I think even on a broader perspective, I'd see symptomatic things that happen in organizations when there becomes a detachment between, and here's the irony of it, your mission to North America and a detachment from what the actual mission should be as laid down by the General Assembly. That's the irony of it. And you see almost an insular type of approach to things where leadership in an organization can become detached both from the mission, from those underlying ministries in this case that are strong and doing some good things. And it leads to, distrust. That's what you see down on a grassroots level, a lot of distrust, communications that aren't consistent with what we thought would be coming from a denominational committee like this. And such. Those are some of the issues that I see. It's not an uncommon type of thing. I mean, in organizations, whether it's business, churches, nonprofits, schools, whatever, but there becomes this, what I would call almost an autonomy and a lack of accountability that drives a lot of these outcomes that Matthew discussed or others have discussed.
Yeah, it seems kind of natural sometimes for organizations, whether they're churches or ministries or nonprofits, to experience something like mission creep, which is kind of the idea that you start off doing one thing. This is your calling, and maybe even put it on paper in a couple of bullet point headings. But then as the organization grows, you begin to take on staff, you begin to have greater budgeting capabilities, and then you begin to take on some of the particularities of other people's more nuanced interests. And I think that's where maybe M&A went just slightly afield of their on-paper job description for what they're supposed to do for the PCA, became something slightly different than that. And in the certain cases that M&A tended to virtue signal about what some of their priorities were, I think they found themselves out of concert with at least many of the PCA's members and pastors and churches. And so there's just a little bit of disequilibrium there between what they're supposed to do on paper and then some of the things that they're actually doing. So that caused a little bit of a stir last General Assembly.
Yes, and you raised the General Assembly, and of course, the coordinator's election at this last General Assembly was one of the most sharply divided. I mean, it was still a 2/3 majority, I think, that voted to rehire the coordinator for another year. There were impassioned speeches. I want to play one from Sean Lucas, just speaking in favor of Irwin Inns as to be reelected, and get your thoughts on the substance of the speech, if we can.
Teaching elder Sean Lucas, Covenant Presbytery. I rise as someone whose church is very invested in the work of MNA. Not only do we support the work of MNA in our missions budget, but we also support a number of individual church planters. We were one of the founders of the Mid-South Church Planting Network. I chaired that network for a number of years, and we have been active in seeking to raise up church planters through our own foundation financially, as well as creating a pipeline of future church planters. I can say without equivocation that Irwin Ince's leadership has been instrumental to what we have done in my congregation. Fathers and brothers, I would urge us to approve once again Teaching Elder Ince as our coordinator for MNA, because he is a transformational leader. He has turned the focus of MNA back towards church planting, not simply handing it off to regional church planting networks, but coming alongside himself as well as with his staff to resource these church planting networks and churches that are passionate about church planting so that we might carry out the good work that God has given given us to do in our respective regions. That work would not have happened without Erwin's leadership. He is a transformational leader for this time. He is also, as we know, a humble preacher and a hope-filled pastor. Even just in our meeting today, we have seen his humility and his apology and his willingness to recognize where MNA made mistakes, but he is also led with hope in a denomination that at times might create challenges for some. He's gone to each part of our denomination, all the way to Canada even, to bring the good news of God's mission to bear for the work of the Presbyterian Church, not just in the United States, but in America, including Canada as well. But finally, I speak as one who's been yoked together with my friend for well over a decade, and he has been a faithful friend to help me carry out mission at IPC Memphis, but also as we've gone through our own journey of difficulty with my wife's health, he has been a faithful pastor and friend to me. For all these reasons, as a transformational leader, as a humble and hopeful preacher and pastor, as a faithful friend, as one who's passionate about church planting, I would encourage the Assembly to vote in favor of the committee's recommendation and once again re-elect Erwin Entz as our coordinator. Thank you.
So obviously there were a number of speeches in favor, but in light of the information that we have in the present, the interim coordinator's report, you know, that you could be a transformational leader, but it seems like MNA was in a state of disaster.
Let me talk about a couple of things from that, because I'm not going to say anything, of course, disparaging about the brother, because you can do and be a good person, a good pastor and that, but not be able to lead an organization, not be effective in that. So it's not a personal type of thing. It's the outcomes that we were seeing that showed that. I do take some degree of umbrage, if you will, with this transformational leadership, and having done some leadership studies and work in that, these terms get thrown around so much. I mean, truly transformational leadership, I don't see that. That's someone that can engage with others and create a connection that raises the level and the motivation of the whole organization on that, and is attentive to the needs and motives of the followers and such. So I think we overuse these type of labels and such. You know, we all want to be servant leaders, or we want transformational leader, or this or that. There's to be truthful about, there's not that many real transformational leaders who can do that. He was trying to affect some change within the organization. I think that's a given, but I'm not sure where the mandate for the change came from. That's part of that on this, that again, not from the General Assembly. And again, there's this isolation or being insulated from what's going on. As Matthew talked about earlier, you've got a mission and you've got different functions there. You become isolated and you go out into a different area to push programs and such that you wanted to go on. And from a grassroots, a ruling elder perspective, it's a little bit difficult to discern what actually is the mission in North America. Now, I mean, there's a big focus on church planting, and that's part of it. But where's that? You know, where's the direction of that planting? You know, is it? And the regional networks, I think, are strong. I mean, that's I've dealt with a couple of those, so I didn't see a need to really disrupt that, because as you see, there are some cultural and geographical things that play into that. But anyway, I think again, there was not an attempt to disparage. The reality was, and this is in any large organization, if someone's not effective in that position, they'd be a great guy, but they may need to be removed for the good of the whole organization.
It's kind of like putting T. David Gordon as a point guard.
So I kind of agree with what David just said. I think that when you talk about a transformational leader, we have to ask exactly what are we talking about here. Now, when I think of a transformational leader, I think about the kind of person that absolutely galvanizes across the board support, or somebody who brings an organization to an entire new level of excellence, or perhaps somebody who completely changes the orientation and vision of a particular organization or a church. And I wouldn't say that Erwin Entz met the first of those two classifications, but it could be that that's what he meant as the third, and that he was trying to take M&A in some sort of a new visionary direction to pivot away from some of the things that maybe we understood M&A's purpose was. If by transformational leader, we're trying to say that he's a really nice guy and just an all-around good fellow, then yes, absolutely. And let me be the first one to say that I would not want that position myself. There's all sorts of positions within the PCA that I know for a fact I could not handle. I've never been our presbytery's moderator, and I would say no if I was ever nominated. There's all kinds of positions in the boards and the various committees and so forth that I would never say yes to, because I know that they exceed my capabilities of my ability to lead in those particular areas. So I think a transformational leader is the kind of person who's like a once in a generation type leader, who's typically able to bring an institution to new levels of excellence. And I don't think then that Dr. Ince would qualify in that regard. So those are just some thoughts there.
Yeah. I don't want to belabor that point, because there's a lot in this coordinator's report that we need to try to digest together, and I'm thankful for you brothers trying to help me do so. But the current interim coordinator highlights that he has brought a refocus on the explicit mandates of the General Assembly. How novel, right? That a committee of our assembly would focus on what the assembly has given it to do. That seems, so a welcomed a change. So what, as you both reviewed this report, what stood out to you as far as the change that we have in the culture at Mission to North America?
You want to go first, David?
Yeah, a couple of things on that. One is there is a degree of crisis management here, and that the communications and such, and the focus of that. You've got to tear away the superfluous type of things that you're focused on and get back to that core. Again, first things first on this. And then I think there's a recognition that there has to be a rebuilding of trust, because I think that's one of the issues that comes about when you have something like this happen, and a step away and recognize the strengths that you have in the organization, and now how do you bring those to bear on that, because there is good work that happens
much good work
in MNA and such, and you have good people there doing things, and they're very committed to that. I mean, you can look at things when we think of MNA, things that don't normally come to mind, but something like Metanoia Ministries, with Lowell Ivy and that work and such. Some of the disaster response in theory and how that works and such is great. And church planting and being able to go out and do that. So those underlying type of efforts that you have on that are strong, and they have just fallen to the wayside, or fallen in the wake of this, and suffer because of it. So I think there's an understanding that you've got to get back to the basics, back to the fundamentals on this, and there cannot be a rejection. Oftentimes there comes, frankly, a bit of elitism and such in leadership if they're away from, it can't be a total populist type of thing, but there can be an elitism that they know better than these down here who are engaged in this work, or those who support the work, or those who are benefited from the work. So it's pulling back and how do you bring those folks back in and get back again to that critical mission and the vision that you have for the organization.
Yeah, so here's some of my thoughts as I began to read the report. I had kind of a sinking feeling in the pit of my belly as I began to read the first page of the report, because one of the things that it says is that there's so many great successes of M&A, but unfortunately, we're not going to be able to talk about too many of them this year in this particular report. I'm one who, again, very much loves and treasures the PCA. And so I want to hear good news. I want to hear about churches planted. I want to see souls getting saved. I want to see the kingdom of God advancing. I want to see the kingdom of Satan falling. I want to see the glorious name of Christ proclaimed all over the world, but especially in our nation, because we live here and we love it. So I'm looking for these wonderful evidences of God's hand moving. But the paper begins to give a bit of a tone, and in fact, a bit of a ominous warning that there are several things that have to be discussed that the MNA as an organization needs to reveal to the PCA as a whole at the assembly. And so you get this idea in the first couple of pages here that we're going to refocus. We're going to shift away from anything that was a distraction. We're going to cut some of the ideological nonsense. That's my paraphrase. It's not a phrase found in the paper, but you get the idea that we're going to let go some of these distracting ideological functions, and we're going to get back to the main of the main. But there is, in fact, a second shoe that's going to drop here as the paper goes on. And some of it is going to have to do with the finances of M&A. There's some good news and there's some bad news here. Some of the good news is very good. It definitely seems like the ship is going to get righted here right quick. And I have a good positive feeling that what we've read in the report is wonderful directional change as far as our economic feasibility. But there is necessarily some bad news that has to be reported in the paper. I think does that fair enough.
Yeah. There's the financial, which is the 800-pound gorilla in the room, but then there's the cultural aspect at M&A. I think he says there's a fragmented decentralization, just a collection of ministries that are not using their gifts to advance the mission of M&A together, which I think needs. And I think Dowling says that his approach is to unite all of these missionaries, mission agencies, not agencies, but different ministries around the mission of the PCA and of Christ. He says this may seem like a simplistic approach to change culture. It is, but the situation is less complex than it otherwise might be because nearly every person and leader within M&A is dedicated to ministry, committed to Christ, and desirous of teamwork and accountability. And so he says the key obstacle is not hearts, but money. And so if we can relieve the money pressure, we believe the cultural will change, and it already has to some extent. And so do you think that this, the efforts that Interim Coordinator Dowling is making to take away the ideological, the critical theory emphases and refocus on the explicit mandates of the General Assembly, do you think that will help rebuild trust outside of M&A with the churches and the presbyteries, which might help the financial situation even further?
I think that it's funny because when I read through that, it's the money, not the hearts.
Looks like he dropped off, Ryan. So maybe I'll pick up where he was going there. So yes. So as to the good news, this is a ship that can be righted, and I have a very good feeling that Mr. Dowling is exactly the kind of person that we need in this position right now. And the fact that he's interim coordinator gives me really a good heart here, just thinking about the fact that you get the sense from reading this report that we're now in very good hands here in the PCA. Love to see him maybe be the permanent coordinator. I don't know if that's even possible. But in the first couple of pages, they're going to detail several things that we've done almost immediately to get back into the right as far as our accounting goes. And we get the sense here that now they're going to be able to balance the budget and get us back on exactly where we need to be. David, you're back on. You dropped off for a second, and you were in the midst of saying something important.
No, I think it sounds a lot like what you're talking about there, Matthew, when we look at this. Again, the trust issue on that, because I know that some churches, some individuals and such, once these things start happening, then money doesn't flow to M&A general. Money flows to that specific ministry that I want to support. And even questions come up that if I'm supporting a ministry and the money goes to M&A, what's going to happen to that? We've seen these type of things happen. It happened with United Way years ago when they had their financial issues and such. And people started saying, we don't know where this money's going. We thought it was going here. But again, that's just, the trust is difficult to build back.
So Ryan, one of the things that we probably need to talk about is that in M&A, like many churches and institutions and organizations, there are two kinds of funds. One is like restricted funds and none is unrestricted funds. Sometimes we use the term designated funds, but this is the idea that when a giver gives to a church, he or she can sometimes designate exactly what they want that gift to go to. And it's up to that institution or church then to honor that giver's designation to the extent that they're able to do so. So for instance, if you give the Gospel Fellowship PCA and you really want your money to go to the deacons fund, then you can designate that it goes to the deacons fund, and that's where it ought to go. Sometimes it's a little bit hard to match up the donor's intent if there is no such thing that expressly fulfills the donor's intent. But if there is, then the church or institution is morally obligated, I would suggest, to try to utilize those funds in the way that the donor intends them to be. So one of the problems that M&A experienced is that they have a lot more designated or restricted funds than they had general funds. Now, general funds gives a church sort of the freedom to allocate those funds as they think best in real time. In the fog of war, what do we need to spend our money on? What are our priorities? What are our crises? How do we keep moving? And in this ministry, one of the things that this report identifies is that there's so many disparate groups, ministries, functions, and sub-ministries within that a lot of the money was so designated that it actually put kind of a crunch or a crisis on the main, because if let's say 90% of your funds are designated, only 10% is general funds, and you really don't have a lot of latitude to be able to manipulate those funds as you may need to, as a living organization has to sometimes react in real time to budget shortfalls and inflowing as the case may be. And probably the biggest problem here that's identified in this report then has to do with the disaster assistance fund. Within M&A, we have a fund that is supposed to help in disasters such as hurricanes. And here, Ryan, maybe you can dive into this a bit. Here is where the real problem begins to show itself.
Yeah, and on a clarification of that, with the restricted funds and designated funds, restricted funds, usually those received outside. A designated fund, I can do that within the organizational budget. I can designate something and I've got more freedom to move that money. But these restricted funds, and one of the issues came in response to solicitations that said whether it's Hurricane Helene or another event, these 100% of these funds will be used for direct relief for this. So that pretty much ties the organization's hands on that if they are that specific in that solicitation.
What level of organizational dysfunction, or is this simply how ministries operate? And I'm usually, and I'm too small to encounter that kind of thing.
Well, it looks like it got pretty sloppy as it relates to disaster assistance in particular. And so one of the things that the report really begins to detail is this idea that the PCA was receiving funds with the intention that they were going to go towards disaster relief, specifically for particular hurricanes and named storms and things like that. And several times what happens is that in this report, it details that over a period of 17 years, so this unfortunate form of management goes back quite a few years, they began to use funds that were specifically designated towards particular named storms, but then reallocating them to other needs more generally within the M&A ministry as a broader umbrella. So there's some 90 individual transactions that appear to have been misused. And unfortunately, the real problem here, morally speaking, is the PCA had said something to the effect that these funds were going to go 100%. And the phrase is every penny of every dollar is going to go to assisting people who were the victims of these storms. But unfortunately, what happens, it looks like that at first there was a few times that these kinds of funds were moved over to other areas. But then that habit began to be more and more regular, and unfortunately more and more in terms of their amounts. And probably the biggest controversy that's going to be mentioned in this report then is that a number of times, and again, this is a repeated pattern of behavior, funds that were specifically designated to go to help the victims of these storms was actually moved into other areas, including raising support for personnel of MNA, and at least in one case, a high-level individual or high-level personnel moved funds, would seem to me to be into their own account so as to help their own fundraising process. And unfortunately, this is really not a good look for the PCA. And in some cases, only fractions of what was promised to go to the victims of these kinds of storms was actually used for the victims of storms. And it looks like more often than not, the habit began to be that you spend a little bit on those kinds of victims. And then eventually, as a couple of years go by, and yet you still have several $1 million in some cases, moving those funds into other places that are contrary to, or at least unknown to, the donor's intent. That's my read on the report. David, is that how you took it?
Exactly, Matthew. I think that's it. And you hit on a couple of things. One was the escalation of it, both in frequency and in the value on that. And it's and it was over a longer period of time, 17 years of time.
And I don't want to give the impression that anyone was intentionally doing anything nefarious. As I think, Matthew, you noted, this is an ongoing investigation, but as of right now, there was some clear fiduciary duty that was not fulfilled. Is that a fair way of euphemizing it?
Yeah, I'm not making that claim either, that this was done nefariously or criminally. The report does suggest that the PCA is going to get counsel to help figure this out. We're going to consult attorneys, I would imagine, and probably a lot of financial experts to figure out exactly what happened here. What I'm saying is that it doesn't look good. It creates a look that facilitates mistrust, because if you're a donor and you want to help people that just got smacked really hard by a storm, and you actually want your money to go to those people who were most impacted by the storm, you would probably be disappointed to find that your contributions actually went to overhead or staffing or personnel, or was reallocated to other ministries outside of your awareness. So if I could quote a paragraph here, Ryan, if you don't mind, this is from the report itself. It says, the language used to solicitate Hurricane Milton funds included this, quote, every penny of every dollar donated to a designated disaster event goes to help meet the needs presented by these disasters. M&A, nor M&A disaster response withholds any fees for any services. Now that's the end of the quote, but I'm going to still quote from the paragraph here. The total amount raised from Milton was approximately $361,000. On a single day in November of 2025, transfers totaling $329,000, approximately 91% of the fund, were directed out of Hurricane Milton accounts, $294,000 to the Florida Warehouse Project. I don't know what that is, by the way. $20,000 to the M&A General Fund, and $15,000 across 2 staff support accounts. These transfers, thankfully, were frozen before execution. Had they proceeded, at most, approximately 9% of donations solicited under the every penny language could have reached Milton victims. Okay, so that's the worst paragraph, I think, in this report, because it really does seem to undercut trust in the benevolent giving of PCA members, that if we're trying to help victims of a storm, now we're not so sure that that money is actually going to the victims of the storm I thought I was contributing to.
No, and you're right, Matthew, on that. And the one of the fundamental things, again, and we flow back to organizational management and such, is the lack of controls and frankly audit. I don't know what the audit processes are and such. I have a daughter that works for one of the big 4 accounting firms as an auditor on this, and they absolutely wear out these controls and such for corporations and everything to make sure that these type of things don't happen. And for 17 years for this, I don't know what practices and such were in place and what happened with that, but it erodes that confidence of people who are giving to M&A or to disaster relief, or any of that, where again, a tendency will be to, I'm going to look for someone who will properly manage this money, or the money will go as they've indicated it would, like Matthew talked about in that solicitation that went out.
This is just egregious. 91% of the money raised for Hurricane Milton relief was attempted. Now, I think it looks like Coordinator Dowling put a stop to it, that he was able to
Yes.
intercept that and put it back. But what does this say about the culture of Missions in North America? I think, Matthew, we talked about earlier or last year, the culture of Mission to North America, where some intern or some low-level staffer decides it's perfectly reasonable to put guidance for how illegal immigrants could avoid law enforcement on the website. Nobody thought, maybe I should get approval for this. Well, here again, there's a culture where someone thinks it's acceptable to move money solicited under this every penny language to pay salaries. Not that I'm opposed to salaries being paid, but if we pass the plate and say all of this is going to help the Bristol Faith in Action, so, here in Bristol, Tennessee, and then the secretary says, well, actually, we're going to use it to pay Beezy's salary, people would rightly be outraged.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly correct. And again, we're trying to be very careful here on this podcast because we don't know what motives are. Some mistakes are done out of ignorance, which is to say you don't even know you're making a mistake. And that can certainly happen, but kind of like the way that sin works and that crime works is that, sometimes it's an express act of the will. I know this is wrong and I'm going to do it anyways. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's accidental. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't cause real world harm and damage. And I think that in this case, the real world harm and damage is that M&A now has to rebuild the dike of the trust that they have built over the years, because it would seem to me that some trust, at least a little bit of trust, is going to be lost here when you have this kind of promise, we're doing this to help victims of storms, and then, well, no, actually, a lot of this money, nay, most of the money went for other causes that we thought were justifiable at the moments that we made those decisions. So, it could be total ignorance. It could be incompetence. It could be malfeasance. Who knows? I hope that the further investigations will reveal that for what it is. But in the meantime, we don't want to give up trust in our denomination as such, because we love it. And we do think that, at the end of the day, we think that the PCA is a great expression of Christ's body, and we want to be able to enthusiastically support everything that our denomination is doing.
And we need to be able to trust those who are in leadership. And I am so thankful that Interim Coordinator Dowling has set this before the court and given us this time to look at it before General Assembly. David, from your experience in strategic management, a number of the key personnel, senior leadership, are still there, right? Murray Lee, Mark Casson, they're still the men who should have been assisting and creating and cultivating a culture of accountability, of fiduciary faithfulness. They're still there. So what responsibility do you think that top level management has when the senior official is gone?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I think Matthew's right on this. I don't jump to conclusions at this point on what I'm focused more on what controls do you put in place to avoid this? How do you rebuild that trust and such? So I'll let that process work itself out on that. But again, the expectation at that level and such is that you have a knowledge of some of these basics, enough to ask a question. There was a Kipling quote in a bad leadership book by Barbara Kellerman. It says, "But I'd shut my eyes in the sentry box so I didn't see nothing wrong." And, if you're at that level, your eyes have to be open and you have to have a base level of understanding. So I think there's some education that needs to be going on. A lot of times all of us become complacent in a role. We get used to the status quo and how things have been and such. And it doesn't make it right, but there's this sense of, well, we've always done it that way, so we'll continue. that. Well, you may have always done it that way, but right now that way has to stop. And we have to see what the response has to be like that. So I think we let this play out. And again, with Steve Dowling there, I think that you can set a tone on that. I think that's when you look to the next chairperson there. The competency issue needs to be addressed on this. I mean, a lot of times, and incompetency, as I'm putting it, is not a disparaging remark on anyone. It would be more of a lack of competency. We used to say that there were two parts. There's a capability and a responsibility, and if those two travel along together, then the organization grows. If you give people that don't have the capability too much responsibility, you put the organization at risk on that. So it's lack of competence in certain areas. So there needs to be an understanding, what competencies are we looking at the chair level and these other senior staff levels? What competencies do we need? What gaps do we have that we may need to fill, lack of understanding and such, and how do we move forward with that? And so let this process roll out on that.
That's a very good word. So what, as we kind of bring it in for a close here, do you have confidence? Are you optimistic regarding the future of Mission to North America? I think it sounds like you are. We've got a great interim coordinator. I hope that he's going to be given another year to serve as interim this year. Well, Matthew, why don't you start?
Yeah, I feel really good about this. Honestly, I know some of the things that I said in this video were kind of negative as I'm reacting to the information that's given in this report. I think everybody will feel about the same way I do, though, I trust, because while there are many wonderful and great accomplishments, no doubt about that, what we've read is a very honest and self-effacing report in which one of our agencies has looked hard in the mirror and they're willing to tell us exactly what they've seen. And that we should be very thankful for. It's one thing for an institution to make mistakes or a church to make mistakes from time to time. Again, motive aside, we don't know whether it's ignorance or just incompetence or malfeasance. We don't know. But we love it when an institution is honest enough to say, here are our mistakes. Here they are on paper. Take them for what they are. We're going to try to get this thing fixed. And rather than a litany of excuses, no, not excuses at all, Interim Coordinator Dowling gave us a very honest report of exactly what needs to be done. And so this helps to buoy my spirits as I think about this. It gives me confidence that, yes, the PCA is great and we have great things still to do. This will be a blip in the radar and it'll be a bump on the road. It'll be a bit of a tarnish on our face. And perhaps even we might have to do a little bit of trust rebuilding over the years. That's probably the reality of it. But again, our confidence is in Christ. His church is invincible in as much as we stay true to him and to his word. The mission to North America and its fundamental goals is very important, so we can't let go of it. I would not try to discourage PCA members from getting involved personally, from churches, getting informed personally, finding ministries to support. I'm definitely not the person to say, hey, mistakes were made, therefore avoid it from now on. No way. I think if anything, we double down our intentionality, our support, our prayers, not only for MNA, but for MTW as well, for the rest of our ministries and the many arms of the PCA's long reach. Final word for me, Ryan, we're an important denomination, and I would never minimize or diminish that. We are, in some sense, the flagship Reformed denomination, not only in NAPARC, but I think in the English-speaking world as it relates to Reformed and Presbyterian churches. So never get discouraged, brothers. These things do happen, unfortunately, from time to time. Sometimes people need to get fired. Sometimes new leaders need to take over. Sometimes agencies need to go back to the foundation and re-outline their very purpose for existence. But if we do that well, then I see good things coming, and I'm thankful for this report. I think it was honest, brutally honest, but absolutely necessary to take the next step forward.
Well said. David, we'll give you the last word on this.
Yeah, I agree with Matthew on that. My hope does not lie in committees and princes and principalities. My hope lies in Christ. And again, the report was brutally honest, and it was a forthright report, and it gave some things to focus on, and there's still work to do on that. But I'm encouraged that this will be a wake-up call, if you will, and what will come out of this will be a refocus of MNA on those things that are critical. And again, that's to establish ordinary means of church of grace churches out there, to be prepared to help brothers and sisters in need when that happens, and to be able to proclaim the love of Christ to them, and to be able to go into the prisons, go into the jails, and proclaim the word. All those basic things. Cut out some of the extra stuff. Focus on that. Get leadership in place that does that. It'll be a wake-up call to the permanent committee, or at least my opinion is it better be. The same. It'd be interesting on committee of commissioners for MNA, what comes up in that meeting this year. So if nothing else, sometimes you have to be snapped out of complacency. And at the least, it's complacency on that and refocused. And again, a laser focus on what the mission of Mission to North America is and how we do that, because there are churches out here that need help. There are areas out here that we need to plant churches, and that needs to be focused. And it's not just, it's New York City, it's Seattle, it's, Big Stone Gap, Virginia, parts of the Southwest, all over the country.
Piney Flats, Tennessee needs a PCA
Piney
church.
Flats, Tennessee. So they can talk to us about that, Ray and Ryan, and I'll be glad to put one in Gray, Tennessee. We can go all kinds of, but again, focus on that, get rid of the other stuff, and find that leadership, that leadership. Again, I'm not looking at transformational leadership on that. The transformation, again, comes through Christ. We're not to be conformed to the world, but transformed on that. But again, a leadership team that will put this organization in focus and then move forward and rebuild that trust.
Very well said. Well, Matthew, David, thank you so much for your time and your skilled analysis of this committee report.
Thank you, Ryan.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me on, Ryan. See you soon, buddy.
Yes, not soon enough. Thanks for joining the conversation on the Westminster Standard, which is the podcast of Jude 3. For more information or to support our work at promoting confessional renewal within the Presbyterian Church in America, please visit our website, jude3pca.org. Join us again next time. I'll talk to you then.